U.S. economy lost 20.2 million private sector jobs last month, the worst drop in the history of the ADP report. Joining us to talk about the jobs picture and the process of reopening the U.S. economy, Texas Senator Ted Cruz. It hasn't been that long since we saw you, Senator. It's good to have you on this morning. It's a bad, obviously, the jobs number is, we were prepared for it, but never really prepared for something like that. In your view, and you're down in Texas, and you've had your issues, obviously, but we're in New York here. It's a different reopening, I'm sure, down in your state. But how do you view that 20 million job losses? That kind of says we need to reopen where we can, I think, safely.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think we're facing three simultaneous crises that are playing out all at once. We've got, number one, a public health crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, and its effects have been horrific. 257,000 lives have been lost worldwide, and we are taking extraordinary steps to flatten the curve and to slow the spread of the virus and to defeat it. At the same time, we're dealing with an economic catastrophe. Nationwide, we've got, in the last 2 months, over 30 million people have lost their jobs. The workforce nationally is between 160 million and 165 million. That means we're looking at about 20% of the national workforce is out of work in just 2 months. On top of that, you have millions and millions of small businesses that are on the verge of bankruptcy. It is a level of economic devastation that none of us have seen in our lifetimes. And then third, a third crisis that we are feeling, particularly in my home state of Texas, is an energy crisis. That right in the midst of this pandemic, we had Russia and Saudi Arabia make the decision to wage economic hostility on the United States to flood the world markets with oil, and that, along with the sharp reduction in global demand, precipitated a massive drop in energy prices, and that too threatens millions of blue-collar jobs in my home state of Texas and across the country. And I can tell you, I'm spending every waking moment focusing on dealing with and defeating those three simultaneous crises.
Well, things in the oil patch had been looking a little better. We were well above 25 earlier in the session. Now that is down significantly. WTI and the market is no longer up triple digits. Andrew, you have a question for the senator?
I just wanted to ask the senator, one of the big other issues is we're going to have states and municipalities which are going to run into a lot of trouble. And Governor Cuomo from New York yesterday made a point of saying that New York is going to need a lot more federal money, and made a particular point of saying that New York was the biggest giver in the country in terms of tax revenue rather than a taker. And given that we've had conversations, Senator, you and I, over the years about the givers and the takers, and about what money should go when there are emergencies to different states, what your view is of how funding should ultimately be made.
Well, I think in the course of this crisis, we've seen remarkable bipartisan consensus in dealing with the crisis. Congress, in the last 2 months, we have spent roughly $3 trillion. That is a massive amount of money. It's a staggering amount of money. And that included hundreds of billions of dollars that have gone to states and local governments. So states and local governments are on the front lines dealing with this, and I think that relief was important. As we return to session, and the Senate is back in session this week, so I'm in Washington. We've all been working from home for the past month, but we're back here now. We're in the midst of discussion about, is there going to be another legislative package? And it seems that the top priority of congressional Democrats is what you just raised, Andrew, which is sending. Nancy Pelosi is talking about $1 trillion or more that she wants to send to the state and local governments. And I'll tell you the concern with that, which is that there are a number of states that have been highly irresponsible and have not lived within their means and have dug unsupportable pension holes that have nothing to do with this crisis, that preexisted this crisis. And if you take, for example, the state of Illinois, Illinois' unfunded pension liability is $241 billion. And that was the cause that was caused by politicians who were just buying votes, and they were buying votes by making commitments to the public employee unions that they didn't have the revenue to sustain. And I got to tell you, from the perspective of the rest of the country, look, Texas, my home state, we've lived within our means. We haven't dug a multi-hundred-billion-dollar hole and spent money we didn't have, and I don't see any reason why the people of Texas should pay higher taxes to bail out states that have been irresponsible. So I think that is going to be a major issue of disagreement in the Senate. If we're focused on dealing with the coronavirus crisis, fine, but it shouldn't be an excuse to bail out states for irresponsibility and fiscally reckless policies that long preceded the coronavirus pandemic.
Hey, Senator, I agree with you 100%. I don't think that's an issue that anybody would feel too comfortable with, bailing out a pension plan that hasn't been funded in years and even decades in some cases. But what we're talking about is very different than that. If you talk to the governor of New Jersey, the governor of New York, they will say that they have a huge hole in their revenue because every business in their state has been shut down for, at this point, going on 8 weeks. That's a very different scenario when you talk about the revenue that they're able to bring in a result. And Governor Murphy, we spoke with last week from New Jersey, said, look, this is an instance where I can't use that money to do things like pay my teachers or pay any of the police officers unless the work that they're doing on is very specifically related to coronavirus. And I think that's where the rub comes in. Obviously, it's clear that if it's coronavirus needs that you need for the hospital or something going on, obviously everybody's going to agree on that. If it's the pension funds that have never been put in, I think everybody agrees pretty universally on that. We should not be using this time to take advantage of this crisis to do something like that. But it's the stuff in the middle that comes down in the states that have been hit hardest, where they're not getting any revenue coming in. How do they pay for continuing services, and where do you come down on that?
And listen, that is a real challenge. In the last 2 months, I have spoken to mayors and county judges and local leaders all across the state of Texas. And that's a concern being felt at every level of government, that the tax revenue for those jurisdictions, just like the federal government, the tax revenue has plummeted. And I do think there is a reasonable case to be made for greater flexibility with the money that we have already sent to the states and the local governments. And I told the mayor of Houston that I would take the lead pressing for greater flexibility, and in particular, the ability to spend that money on law enforcement needs. Law enforcement needs are obviously among the most vital that state and local jurisdictions have, and the initial restrictions required such a tight nexus to coronavirus treatment that many state and local officials were concerned they couldn't spend them on meeting the obligations of law enforcement. I urge my colleagues that we add flexibility, and I'm glad to say, as a result of urging that added flexibility be given yesterday, the Department of Treasury put out a guidance making clear that the states and local governments have considerably more flexibility to use those funds both for law enforcement and for fire departments as essential public safety endeavors. And so I think that makes sense. The next question is, should there be substantially more funds that go to the state and local governments? I expect that to be hotly debated within the Senate. And one of the challenges is, look, yes, tax revenues are down, so are federal tax revenues. And it's not like there is a magic money tree in Washington that is producing this money. This is money we're just borrowing. And at some point, the solution has got to be recovery, getting people back to work. It's why my focus is on tax reform and regulatory reform, reducing the burdens on small businesses so as they open their doors, they can succeed and prosper and thrive. That's how we get out of this economic crisis.